Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What We Know About LGBTQ plus Representation in Research. My name is Yarisa Reyes. I'm one of three national directors of diversity, equity, and inclusion engagement at the Alzheimer's Association. My pleasure to be with you today. Today's webinar is being recorded and will also be made available on demand to watch later. It is Pride Month. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Pride Month is currently celebrated each year in the month of June to honor the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in Manhattan. According to the Library of Congress, the Stonewall Uprising was a tipping point for the gay liberation movement in the United States. In the US, the last Sunday in June was initially celebrated as Gay Pride Day, but the actual day was flexible. In major cities across the nation, the day soon grew to be encompass a whole month-long series of events. Today, celebrations include pride parades, picnics, parties, workshops, symposia, concerts, and LGBTQ Pride Month events attract millions of participants around the world. Memorials are held during the month for those members of the community who have been lost to hate crimes or HIV/AIDS. The purpose of the commemorative month is to recognize the impact that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals have had on history locally, nationally, and internationally. The LGBTQ community may face particular challenges related to Alzheimer's and dementia. These include finding inclusive and welcoming healthcare providers, less ability to call upon adult children for assistance, concerns about stigma, and higher rates of poverty and social isolation. At the Alzheimer's Association, we believe that diverse perspectives are critical to achieving health equity, meaning that all communities have a fair and just opportunity for early diagnosis and access to risk reduction and quality care. The association is committed to engaging underrepresented and underserved communities and responding with resources and education to address the disproportionate impact of Alzheimer's and dementia. Members of the LGBTQ community who are spouses, partners, and family members caring for someone living with Alzheimer's may also face challenges in finding culturally sensitive care, support networks, and other resources. There's relatively little clinical research on the LGBTQ plus community and Alzheimer's and other dementia, but researchers are exploring these important and neglected issues. Today's webinar explores the underrepresentation of LGBTQ spouses in research studies relating to aging and Alzheimer's disease. A leading expert explains what we know today and how participation of LGBTQ plus spouses is critical to advancing scientific understanding and prevention. Today's presenter is Dr. Shana Stites. As a clinical psychologist and researcher, Dr. Stites' research focuses on advancing diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's disease in order to promote quality of life and psychological well-being. This includes understanding the impacts of the disease on individuals who may be directly affected by pathology, as well as their family members. As part of this work, Dr. Stites has a special focus on better understanding how aspects of identity, such as age, gender, and race, operate as determinants in the disease experience. Understanding these features of the disease experience may offer insights into disease mechanisms and into development of interventions that help limit burdens of the disease. Dr. Stites is a graduate of the National Institute on Aging Butler Williams Scholars Program, has a Master's of Arts in Sociology from Lehigh University, and earned a doctorate in clinical psychology from Chestnut Hill College, with a concentration in psychological assessment and special focus on the role of multicultural diversity in clinical practice and representation in research. Dr. Stites' clinical training includes completion of a doctoral internship at Corporal Michael J. Crescent's VA Medical Center in Philadelphia, and postdoctoral training in the Penn Memory Center and Department of Neurology at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. Without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Shana Stites. Take it away, Dr. Stites.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It really is my pleasure to be here at the beginning of June of Pride Month to talk on this topic. The title of my talk today is Patterns Among Same-Sex Spousal Couples in Alzheimer's Research and How It Matters. The overarching theme, though, and what I'm really talking about, is representation and underrepresentation of the LGBT community. And the reason why there's a mismatch in those two themes will become more evident as I go through some of the data that I'm presenting here today. Or not. The work that I'm discussing today has been funded, including my position as well, has been funded by the National Institute on Aging, as well as other NIA grants and the Alzheimer's Association. Let me start with a couple definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. Sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And these are using basically our government definitions. Sex is defined as the difference in biological or physiological characteristics of males and females, such as reproductive organs, chromosomes, and hormones, etc. That's the US federal government definition. However, the World Health Organization uses a more expansive definition that also includes intersex. Gender, the socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between groups of men and women. Thirdly, sexual orientation, a part of individual identity that includes a person's sexual and emotional attraction to another person and the behavior and/or social affiliation that may result from that attraction, or again, from that sense of community. These definitions are fairly narrow, but again, they're the ones that we are that are informing our current government policies. My talk today could be thought of as a presentation of two different studies. In study one, it's a question of, is anybody there? How is sex, gender, and sexual orientation being measured in Alzheimer's disease and aging research? Depending on what's happening there and how it's being measured or whether it's being measured, goes a long way in helping us understand what representation of LGBT communities looks like in this research. And then study two, using the measures that are available to identify these communities. What do we know about same-sex or LGBT communities in aging and Alzheimer's research? And then I'll close out with this. So where do we go from here and what does it mean? So study one, I'll start with the conclusion. Anybody there? We're not measuring sex, gender, or sexual orientation. Well, we're not measuring sexual orientation for the most part. And it's really unclear whether we're measuring sex, gender, both, neither. Let me talk a little bit about the research that has led to that conclusion. My colleagues and I conducted a national survey study where of Alzheimer's disease and aging research cohorts. Research cohorts are a key resource in the investigation into aging and Alzheimer's disease mechanisms. Quite frankly, it's where the bulk of what we know about these diseases or these conditions and experiences, it's where the bulk of that science comes from. Some aging and Alzheimer's disease cohorts have operated for decades, they provide a unique historical record for us to be able to look at how measurement has been happening, how it's changed, and what it looks like currently. And for us also then to understand, so what's our science reflecting, right? What we know about these communities. Some of these cohorts have existed for decades. In this histogram here, you see some going back as early as the 1950s through all the way up to some new ones that are gotten started in like 2019. The vertical lines on this graph are showing when some of the key policies were put in place in terms of in 1994. This is where NIH's policy on the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research was implemented. Well, in 2014, this was the NIH's policy on sex as a biological measure was implemented, and still some of the details there are being worked out. But we can see there were many studies that existed well before the institution of these policies. In this study, we went through all of these cohorts and we evaluated what measures they had in place. We also evaluated when those measures had been used or implemented, right? Given this, we see that some of these studies existed well before policies were in place to guide how the studies might implement these measures. And taking all that into consideration, any changes the studies made and how they were actually currently measuring sex, gender, and sexual orientation, this slide summarizes those findings. And what we see for the most part is that within Alzheimer's disease and aging centers that maintain cohorts and investigator-led science studies, we found that most of them were measuring sex, defined binarily as self-report in most cases. We had a study that was evaluating gender or something similar to that. We had no studies that were, two studies that were collecting data on sexual orientation. And so really with what you're seeing here is it's really difficult to know if there are LGBTQ and gender diverse individuals participating in aging and Alzheimer's disease research, because in most cases we're not counting, we're not measuring to know that whether or not individuals are there. There's also the methods that have been used where those measures are happening. There's often no written protocol. Sometimes it's an RC making a research coordinator making a judgment as to what an individual's identity is. Other times it's a question without enough context for a person who might be responding to that question to really know what the question is getting at. So again, the data are very thin as to what populations are being represented in aging and Alzheimer's research. So let's make the most out of what we can. And how would we analyze the data to look at these communities as best possible, right? And that was the purpose of the second study. Let's make do. And with that said, one way to do that, since the most common measure was around binary sex or self-report sex, was to find a data resource that would be collecting that information from multiple people and view them as same-sex dyads. Now, a little bit of background of why, in some ways, that makes an awful lot of sense. Maybe not the same-sex part, but looking at dyads, that can have a huge impact on research. And it's more than just trying to figure out whether these are we can identify same-sex couples or not. In Alzheimer's disease, the field of Alzheimer's disease, clinical trials are being conducted in persons who have a range of cognitive function. That is from totally cognitively typical to individuals who have mild cognitive impairment or mild stage dementia. And these clinical trials are being conducted in order to identify disease-modifying therapies. And so that is, if we can test these drugs in individuals who have no cognitive impairment and then administer a drug, we might be able to help people stay symptom-free longer. It is really important that those trials have a sociocultural and biological diversity in their samples, because they are the ones that are informing the bottom line results of whether we conclude that these drugs do or do not work, or whatever intervention is being tested. To enroll in those trials, dyads, a person usually has to identify a study partner. I call them SP in my slides. And that's because who better than someone close to the participant, close to you, to report data on how your cognition is functioning, if you've had any changes, how you're responding to being part of the study. And so in this case, we have this convergence of wanting to study same-sex couples as the closest proxy we can get into studying the wide diversity within the LGBT community. And the fact that studying dyads in Alzheimer's research and aging research makes a lot of sense, because people's cognition might be changing and having an inter-rater reliability is really important. So in this study, this was the Aging Demographics and Memory Study. It's called ADAMS. And for individuals to enroll in ADAMS, they had to identify a study partner. And so when they were designing the ADAMS study, they went to the health and retirement community, which is a very large, about 36,000 people, strong people cohort study that's been going on for many decades. And they recruited out a subset of individuals to approach them to participate in ADAMS. And in that process, they had to identify a study partner. And then they were followed in ADAMS over time. And so this provides a unique opportunity to go from a community-based population that was participating in a cohort study through into another cohort study that was measuring cognition. And so it would serve as a model for understanding Alzheimer's disease research and how some of that recruitment and participation worked. The ADAMS study overall is a sample of community dwelling individuals, 70 years or older. All participants had to identify a study partner at the time they enrolled into ADAMS. The study partner was someone who was required to be familiar with the subject's daily activities, medical history, it could be a close family member, child, or spouse who usually stepped into that role. And that study partner provided cognitive functioning ratings on the participant who was the primary enrollee. The primary enrollee also underwent neuropsychological assessment. HRS ADAMS asked about sex, and in this case, it was defined as being a male or female. And following from that definition in the parent study, we refer to the individuals in these dyads, we delineate them as same-sex couples. The degree to which we are measuring sex and or gender in our study is worthy as a sort of a note. So looking at the demographics, we see on the left here in this slide, the study partner. We had 730 study partners that were enrolling into this research. And we see that on average, they were about 63 years old. The largest group was, in terms of education, were individuals with a high school education. They were mostly women. They mostly identified as white. We move down that column, something that stands out in particular is the relationship to the subject. And we see pretty much a third, spouse, child, other relationship. And about a third of individuals identified from one of those groups identified as being a caregiver of the primary participant. In terms of the subject who was enrolling into ADAMS, we see that they were slightly older, on average 82 years old, still mostly female, mostly self-identified as white. And in this case, most had a high school education or less. Or I'm sorry, less than a high school education. I wonder if I can, sorry everybody for watching me move this box around my screen. And so we looked at, one thing we did in the study was looked at demographic and clinical correlates of the spousal study partners. And here we find in reading from left to right here, we have the first column is a spouse, and then the characteristics of the spouse. And then in the middle, we have a bivariate model. And so that's just looking at the characteristic of the spouse, of the individual, the spouse, and whether or not they became a study partner in the study. And then we have on the last column a full model, and that's controlling for other confounders that could be associating with that relationship. Was the main, we were hoping to identify what's the main characteristic that was predicting whether or not somebody became a study partner for the primary participant in this study. And so in our bivariate model, we see there's a few factors that jump out in terms of being predictors of whether this spouse stepped in as a study partner. And that was self-reported health, age, if the participant had a brother, and a higher number of children. When we control the potential for potential overlap or confounding, we look at our full model and we see that the two main factors that jump out as being predictors of whether or not a spouse steps in to be a study partner in aging research is the age of the individual and whether or not there's a sister. And so, and that's of the participant, the age of the participant, and whether the participant has a sister. About 35% of study partners were spouses, 39% were adult children, and 27% fell into this other group. When we went through those predictor models that were spouses, and then I sort of skipped through their adult children and someone other than a child, here are the bottom line results. Spouses were most likely to serve as a study partner, especially if the subject was older and did not have a sister. For an adult child, to serve as a study partner, one of the main indicators was that there was not a spouse available, and that the subject was older, a woman, and had more impairments and more living children, functional impairments, and had more living children. So if it's not a spouse and it's not an adult child, it's someone else serving as a study partner. And in that situation, it would be that the subject was a man, had a spouse, more years of education, and no living adult daughters, and more living sons. And as you might begin to see here, as I'm talking through these results, there are certainly some patterns of related to gender that are starting to emerge in the findings, of just starting to push to indicate maybe some gendered patterns in who steps into that role as a participant, or has a study partner that can sort of aid them in stepping into that role. All right, so we keep moving forward, and we want to start to look at those spousal dyads in terms of now they're in the study, they're in Adams. And we want to look at the spousal dyads in terms of gender. And so we break them into 4 different groups. We have women study partners who are rating women participants. We have men study partners who are rating women participants, women study partners rating men participants, and men study partners rating men participants. And here are the demographic breakouts. You see, going across for spouses, we have women rating women. We have 2 who were identified as spouses. We have men rating women. We have who were spouses. That's 75. Almost half the people that were men rating women were identified as spouses. And we have women as study partners rating men participants, and then we have 166. And so far more than half of that group. And then where we have men rating men participants, and who are identified as spouses, we have 6. So again, we see spousal representation for same-sex couples to be quite small, quite limited, in being 2 what would be identified as lesbian couples, and 6 couples that would be identified as gay. We do see some more sort of same-sex dyads, though, when we move into, let's say it's an adult daughter who's rating their mother, right? Then we see 159 people who have included. More than half of that group is being represented as adult daughters who are co-enrolling with their mothers. Men rating women participants, and that would be a son who's enrolling with their mother, would be 48 people. Where you have women rating men participants. So this would be a daughter who's enrolling to be with her father. We have 47 people. And then we have men rating men as adult children. So this would be a son who's now co-enrolled with their dad, 25. So the representation definitely increases once we move to the adult child category. So bottom line here is we are working with the data as best we can, in terms of we only have self-report data for a binary measure of sex, but we do have a spousal indicator. And when we put those together, we see there's very little representation of same-sex couples, whether that's within women or within men. We keep going. I can give you a little bit of data about the characteristics of those couples. And then I can tell you a little bit about why it would matter that we end up with same-sex spousal dyads enrolling in this research. And so again, our ends are very thin here. But if we're asking who are these people, well, we find out that they're slightly older, right? Females and male dyads are in their 70s. They're white, or largely white. And they actually probably are a little more educated compared to this sample at large, right? Most of the sample, or the dominant education level, is high school or less. And here we have a split between a high school grad and some college. We also have, for our male dyads, we see a representation of caregivers. This is an image just to make it a little easier to visualize. It's a Venn diagram of living spouses, adult children, who identify as caregivers. And so we have these overlapping circles to show where we have a household that would, or a family system that would have a living spouse and an adult child. So basically where those two circles on the left overlap, we could say that both of those individuals could theoretically be available to enroll as a study partner. On the right, we're introducing, and so, I'm sorry, just let me continue a little bit more on the left here. And so for the most part, the people who are enrolling in this research, there's a lot of overlap between those two circles. And so these are family systems where you have spouses available and you have adult children available. There's very few in terms of representation where you have a spouse in the absence of any adult children. Again, this is probably reflecting the demographics of these generations. When we look at the right, we see that same set of circles with spouse overlapping with adult child. But here I've introduced a third circle, which is caregiver. And you'll see that caregiver does take up a piece of the pie for both the adult children and for spouses, that role. However, there's a lot of people that are participating that are not necessarily identifying it as a caregiver. Historically, I think ADRD researchers relied heavily on the fact that these were individuals who were older or maybe had other cognitive and functional impairments, and so had caregivers available to help to facilitate enrolling in research. But really, when we pull that lens out, there's a lot of people who are there who don't have caregivers, who may be healthy and not requiring that level of care. And so there's really some choice about who is or who can be enrolling and the dyad, what that dyad could look like. All right, and so let me move on to the question of like, why would it matter? We've established there's, even using the measures we can, there's very low representation. There's opportunities to get more representation. And so why would it matter that we take advantage of that and we push into this space and possibly advocate for better measurement, or we help our friends enroll in this research? Well, it's because it matters what the composition of that dyad, of whether it's a spouse or it's an adult child and who's rating the participant, makes a difference. What you're seeing here on this slide is spouse and adult child study partner ratings of a subject's overall memory in a subsample of people who had what would be considered typical cognition. All right, so this is like your typical older adult, and they were being rated by a spouse on the left and an adult child on the right. And again, I'll say it sort of explicitly, these are memory ratings. And so they're foundational to aging and to Alzheimer's disease research. Memory ratings are frequently used as an endpoint in the clinical trials that are ongoing. What we see here on the left is that spouses rate their subjects worse in terms of memory function than the adult children. That's the bottom line. And so at least we can say that whether you've got your spouse rating you or your adult child rating you, it makes a difference on what they see, holding all other things constant, right, in people who are otherwise cognitively typical. Here, this is another rating for memory and for activity level. And you can see that broken out by gender as opposed to relationship. And these are unadjusted. And so this is really just the study partner's direct rating of overall memory on the left and an activity scale, right? How active is that individual? In both cases, higher scores are worse. And so on the left, you see that women rating women participants and men rating women participants, those are the highest scores across those bars, well, and for overall memory. And so it's really women are being rated worse in terms of memory than their male counterpart participants. And on the right, for activity, we see women rating women and men rating men as being as worse activity levels. And so again, just bare bones going across these findings here. What you see are those bars are certainly not even, right? And so depending on who you have rating you in one of these trials or who you're rating, it matters. And when we, interestingly enough, when we adjust for differences in cognition and function among the participants, so things that really could be driving, maybe this person X is different than this person Y, but if we hold those things constant, we see things change a little bit. We see here, the bars that are the highest is women rating men and men rating men in terms of activity level, higher scores. And so in this case, all of a sudden women are faring better once you control for the level of cognitive or functional impairment that might be going on. Here's our memory rating by a gender dyad group. So again, we have men rating men, women rating men, and then bottom left, men rating women and women rating women. And the general trend to look for here is that higher scores are worse memory. And so you can see on the top that women rating men, there's a slightly worse score. And that women rating women, there's sort of an uneven pattern, but certainly a spike towards the right side of that distribution, that those scores are worse. And again, without over-interpreting the data here, what we can say is that all of these graphs that we're looking at here certainly don't look the same, right? There's a wide amount of variation across the different distributions. And that would suggest that, again, who is rating you and who you're being rated by makes a difference. So in conclusion, at least there's very few people being counted as LGBT, but at least among those few that are being counted, we can show that in many ways they resemble normative patterns in the broader sample in terms of education, education's a little higher, but age, race, spousal distribution, and adult children. Gay men were 3 times as likely to be spousal study partners than lesbian couples, even though, parsing numbers here, women outnumbered men. And that's an interesting characteristic because it goes counter to the norms in our general society. And it was just the male dyads who are stepping in here, the gay couples, they're pushing the limits of within gender norms to be part of this research. Our findings show that sex, gender, and relationship type matter, and sexual orientation, following from that, sexual orientation probably also likely matters. If perhaps we can design a recruitment to be effective for these socio-demographic groups that are present, but at the margins of representation, we can maybe slowly work ourselves into better and better representation in these studies. Again, given the differences that we're seeing in these data, it's really important to have diverse representation as best possible. And that means getting the word out to others, being informed about studies. There are websites that are listed, telling our friends, maybe enrolling with friends and not spouses, if that's what we have, pushing to have our identities counted within this research. And then, yeah, I think that's it. I got ahead of myself on the last one. If the forms don't include questions about sex, gender, sexual orientation, then if you're comfortable doing so, please speak up to be counted. Thank you. I want to acknowledge the study team at Penn. Here are some papers on the right. This study was very narrow, and it looked at people in the health and retirement study that then enrolled into Adams. But another investigator here, the third one in this list, Lou, looked at all of HRS to understand patterns across same-sex couples, and found out of the 36,000 people that were being followed in HRS, there were about 100 same-sex couples. So again, we've still got really small numbers, not as small as the ones I'm talking about here enrolling into Adams, but nonetheless, we really need to boost our representation. And some photos here of the various people who have helped to make this sex, gender, and sexual orientation research possible. So thank you all very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions.